Call the meeting of County Council order. Please rise for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you for coming. First up is an optional prayer or invocation. Mrs. Wall.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Let us pray. Ponder, what do you need to shed or throw aside to get to Jesus? Merciful God, our thoughts and deeds too often do not reflect what they should. Our speech and actions do not often show others what they should. Help us to be more in line with what we should be and what we should be doing as your people. We ask this in the name of our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Thank you. Roll call, please, Mr. Smith.
Mr. Anderson,
Here.
Mrs. Fatika,
Here.
Mr. Horton,
Here.
Mr. Leone,
Here.
Mrs. Law,
Here.
Mr. Rastetter,
Here.
Dr. Faust.
Here. Next is hearing the public. Anybody that called in ahead of time will have 5 minutes. Anybody thereafter will have 3. Mr. Barnes called in. Welcome.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Faust. My name is Randy Barnes, and I do reside in Dr. Faust's district. And I want to thank all you public servants, because as I mentioned Andre earlier, I realize this is nearly a volunteer job, and thank you for it. But I'm here to talk a little bit about carry on from when the last time I was here, and it has to do with Erie County Gaming Revenue Authority. You know, any one of the 7 of you want to write to the Auditor General, you could probably get an audit of what's been going on up there on the Hill for the past few years. Because just me, I'm not an accountant by trade or an auditor, but you know, when I start looking at these things and people are buying stamps off Amazon, you know what? Amazon charges extra for those stamps. So we're taking taxpayer money, instead of going to the post office, paying the flat rate, we're going to Amazon or stamps.com. Here within a week's period, the director spends $166 on postage, 50, 50, 50, and 16. So why does the county, I want to know, well, maybe you don't know, Mr. Sparber, do we go to stamps.com or Amazon and buy our postage here at the courthouse? I hope not. I hope not. You know, I did a little bit more into this theft by deception, this whole white-collar crime kind of thing. You know, this white-collar crime refers to when you're financially motivated. It's a nonviolent thing. We don't use guns, or people don't use guns. They use words. They use deceptive words to commit a crime to financially profit from it, white-collar crime. And I pointed this out to you last meeting, and I'm going to point it out again, because I feel this is deception. This is white-collar crime. When in 1 month we get a fall tuition February reimbursement for $5,604.38, check number 2055 to Perry Wood. Less than 6 weeks later, remember what white-collar crime is? You change the words just a little bit to deceive the people. So 6 weeks later, we aren't doing tuition reimbursement anymore. No, that's all gone by the wayside. We're doing professional development for $5,527. Check number 2138 to Perry Wood, less than 6 weeks later. So you don't usually pay for a college reimbursement till after the semester's over. Again, theft by deception, white-collar crime. By the 7 of you sitting on your hands and not contacting the Auditor General en masse, you're giving tacit approval to this. Taking the taxpayers' money and using it unwisely. We've talked about the $1,300, $1,400 rent a month. We've talked about getting Cold Rock delivering water. We've talked about going to Walmart twice in one day for office supplies on Elm Street. You know, I was looking at the, you're not going to believe this, but how do you take an ECRA company credit card and use it 58 times in 1 month? One person. This isn't all the 4 people that have credit cards, or 3 or 4, whatever. I've found 4 different names of people with credit cards. This is one person, one credit card, 58 times they swipe that card. lots of office supplies, stamps. Wasn't there a big thing in Washington where the congressman or some representative got in trouble buying stamps or something through the post, whatever. So much to talk about, not enough, near enough time. But anyways, let's get back to this Auditor General. Why are we concerned about auditing this? Wouldn't this make this ECRA look super great? This auditor came in and thought, there's no problem here. All this money is legit. Let me just get back to, does anyone even know what this Gaming Revenue Authority was supposed to do with the money? Let me read to you from the state, what it's supposed to be done for. This was supposed to be for the host community and the surrounding contiguous communities to do this. Let me read it. Grants will be used to fund the costs of human services, infrastructure improvements, facilities, emergency services, health and public safety expenses associated with a licensed facility operation. So Summit Township and the contiguous townships, municipalities, were supposed to get that money to take care of these added expense of this casino is going to be there. Instead, we're giving money to Roar on the Shore. We're giving money to the Pennsylvania Society so the director can go to the Pennsylvania Society. Well, that's how you commit white-collar crime. You have to get a lot of people around you that have white collars that have money, and they kind of don't really pay attention to what's going on. Because there's only $5,000 that we know of.
Randy,
Thank you
your
very
time
much.
has expired. Anybody else from the public wish to be heard? Seeing no one come forward, do I have a motion to approve the minutes of the October 16th regular meeting? Moved by Mr.
Second.
Horton, seconded by Mr. Leon. Are there any suggested changes or edits to those meeting minutes? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On the minutes, Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leon,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes. Reports of county officials, the county executive or her designee, Mr. Sparber.
None tonight, Mr.
Thank
Chairman.
you. Finance Committee, Mrs. Fatika.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. The Finance Committee met on Thursday, October 25th at 4 o'clock, and we moved to put the following items on the agenda. Under Old Business, Ordinance listed as A, and under New Business, items A through Y. That concludes my report, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mrs. Fatika. Any questions for her? Personnel Committee, Mr. Horton.
Yes, sir. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Personnel Committee also met last Thursday. We agreed to put items Z through AA, AA-B, and double C on tonight's agenda. That concludes my report.
Thank you. Reports of other members of council, Mr. Leon.
I'm going to relinquish my report this evening. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Mrs. Fatika?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chairman. On the evening of October 26th, I was honored to be able to be a guest at the West Ridge Fire Department's 78th Annual Awards Banquet. Individuals were honored for their contributions and for their years of service. And I just want to acknowledge these dedicated volunteers, their families, and all the volunteer firefighters. Thank you so much for your service and for your sacrifice. That concludes my report, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Moving on to.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I'd just like to ask the solicitor a question. If I ask for a motion to this floor, okay, does it require 5 votes of council to put a motion on?
He's referring
Well, it's
to,
not on the agenda right now. It's not on,
No, it's not on the agenda.
well, if you want to, you have to amend the agenda, to get a new, something new on, whether it's a resolution, which is what a motion is. It's really a move to whatever, something short of an ordinance. But to change the amend, or to change or amend the agenda, you need 5 votes.
Well, at this time, I would ask to put on the agenda, under item DD, a motion that I will make at that particular time.
Moved by Mr. Leon to amend tonight's agenda by adding item DD. which would
Second.
be A motion to do what, Mr. Leon? You didn't explain what the motion was.
The motion will be to appoint a Director of Human Relations.
Do you have a name?
Yes, I do have a name. His name is Anthony Logue, Attorney Anthony Logue.
That's your motion?
Yes, it is.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Leon and seconded by Mr. Anderson to amend tonight's agenda. Any comments regarding the amendment of tonight's agenda? This would need 5 votes to amend. Okay? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On the motion, Mrs. Fatika?
Pardon me, I have a question. Are we voting on the motion, or are we voting to,
Motion
on the
just to amend
amendment?
tonight's.
On the amendment, we're voting to amend, correct?
Correct.
All right. Thank you. No.
Mr. Horton?
No.
Mr. Leon?
Yes,
Mrs. Lahl?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
yes,
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Dr. Faust? No, so that motion fails at the moment. Okay, old business, please have a second reading, Mr. Smith, of ordinance number 129, in title only, please.
A second reading of ordinance number 129, 2018, 50th 2018 general fund budget, supplemental appropriation of $256,748, and a waiver of the bid requirements, of $256,000 for the purchase of Infocon server and software updates through sole vendor contract.
Moved by Mr. Horton.
second.
Seconded by Mr. Leon. Any discussion?
Mr. Chairman,
Mr. Leon.
I'd like to move to amend the title and the body of ordinance 129 to read 50th 2018 general fund budget supplemental appropriation of $256,748 and a waiver of the bid requirements in a purchasing code.
So
To
moved.
amend by Mr.
Wait,
Leon.
I'm not done yet.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Thank you. Also, the body is to be being enacted by the county council of the county of Erie pursuant to Act Article 2, Sections 3B1, 3B2F, and Article 8, Section 8 of the Erie County Home Rule Charter, certified by the county executive, that this general fund budget supplemental appropriation, $256,748, and a waiver of the bid requirements in a purchasing code. That's fine.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Leon and seconded by Mrs. Fatika. Is there any discussion regarding the amendment of that ordinance? Mr. Smith, roll call on the amendment.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leon?
Yes,
Mrs. Lahl?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
yes,
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes. Any further comments regarding ordinance number 29 as amended? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On ordinance 129 as amended, Mr. Leon?
yes,
Mrs. Lahl?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
yes,
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
Yes. Do I have a motion to amend tonight's agenda to make second readings of ordinance number 135 and 136?
Mr. Chairman,
Mrs.
I'm-
Fatika.
I move to make second readings of ordinance number 135 and ordinance number 136 for tonight.
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Fatika and seconded by Mr. Anderson. Is there any discussion regarding amending tonight's agenda? Further. Mr. Smith, roll call, please, on further amending tonight's agenda.
Mrs. Lahl?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
yes,
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leon?
yes,
Dr. Faust?
Yes. Second reading of ordinance number 135, please, in title only.
A second reading of ordinance number 135, 2018, 53rd 2018 general fund budget, supplemental appropriation of $3,099, PCOMP Safety Improvement Program Grant.
Moved by Mr. Horton,
Second.
seconded by Mrs. Fatika. Is there any discussion? Smith, roll call, please.
On ordinance 135, Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leone,
Yes.
Mrs. Lahl,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes. Second reading of ordinance number 136, in title only, please, Mr. Smith.
a second reading of ordinance number 136, 2018, 54th, 2018 general fund budget, supplemental appropriation of $1,006, PCOP Safety Improvement Program Grant.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Horton and seconded by Mr. Leone. Is there any discussion? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On ordinance 136, Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leone,
Yes.
Mrs. Lahl,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes. Okay, or, I'm sorry, if you're following along on our agenda tonight, items C through and including T are all budget ordinances, which we will not vote on tonight. We'll vote on those at our next meeting. So what I will do is just give Mr. Smith the floor to take these one at a time to give them their first reading and get them into the record. And we'll pick up after the first reading of ordinance number 54. Mr. Smith, go right ahead.
a first reading of ordinance number 137, 2018, 2019 Debt Service Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 138, 2018, 2019 Employee Fringe Benefit Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 139, 2018, 2019 Health Choices Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 140, 2018, 2019 Mental Health Intellectual Disabilities Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 141, 2018, 2019 Drug and Alcohol Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 142, 2018, 2019 Children and Youth Services Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 143, 2018, 2019 Domestic Relations Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 144, 2018, 2019 Planning Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 145, 2018, 2019 Library Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 146, 2018, 2019 Public Health Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 147, 2018, 2019 Public Safety Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 148, 2018, 2019 Gaming Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 149, 2018, 2019 Liquid Fuels Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 150, 2018, 2019 Pleasant Ridge Manor Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 151, 2018, 2019 Pleasant Ridge Manor Depreciation Reserve Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 152, 2018, 2019 Erie County Care Management Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 153, 2018, 2019 General Fund Budget. A first reading of ordinance number 154, 2018, 2019 Real Estate Tax Levy.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Smith. Next is a possible adoption of resolution number 53, please, in title only.
Resolution number 53, 2018, resolution approving the fiscal year 2018 Community Development Block Grant application and authorizing its submission to the Pennsylvania Department of Community and Economic Development.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mrs. Fatika and seconded by Mr. Horton. Is there any discussion regarding resolution number 53? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On resolution 53, Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leone,
Yes.
Mrs. Lahl,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes. Possible adoption of resolution number 54, please, in title only.
resolution number 54, 2018, County of Erie Fair Housing Resolution.
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Anderson and seconded by Mr. Leone. Is there any discussion? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On Resolution 54, Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leone,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes. Possible adoption of resolution number 55, please, in title only.
Resolution number 55, 2018, approval of pilot agreement with Oak Haven Apartments, Inc.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Anderson.
Second.
Seconded by Mr. Leone. Is there any discussion? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On Resolution 55, Mr. Leone,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes. Possible adoption of resolution number 56, please, in title only.
Resolution number 56, 2018, granting permission to the county executive to file necessary documents dissolving 3 inactive Erie County authorities.
So moved.
Moved by Mrs. Fatika,
Second.
seconded by Mrs. Lowell. Is there any discussion? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On Resolution 56, Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton,
Yes.
Mr. Leone,
Yes.
Dr. Faust.
Yes. Possible adoption of resolution number 57, please, in title only.
Resolution number 57, 2018, approving permanent easement agreement between the County of Erie, Fairview Township, and Pennsylvania Electric Company.
So moved.
Moved by Mr.
Second.
Lowell, seconded by Mr. Leone. Is there any discussion? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
On Resolution 57, Mr. Rastetter,
Yes.
Mr. Anderson,
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika,
Yes.
Mr. Horton, Mr. Leone,
Yes.
Mrs. Law,
Yes.
Dr. Faust,
Yes.
Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Leone.
Mr. Chairman, before we go on, and well, I imagine we're going to get involved as far as the appointments are concerned, I'm going to ask for a special meeting of council. I have 2 other members of council that will go along with that particular request. In order to advertise, what do we need, Doug? How many days?
I believe 24 hours is the minimum.
Okay, then, by what, Thursday, if that's all right with, how about Friday? All right, I'm going to call for a special meeting on a Friday of this week at whatever time any of the council members want. Let's put it at 4 o'clock. Okay, and that'll be for a resolution to appoint the Human Relations Director.
Anything else?
That's it.
Somebody want to make a motion for these appointments? Mr. Horton.
I move that we group items Z, double A, double B, double C together, and that we, I'm asking to move to amend the term of the 4 appointments for 1 year, ending December 31st, 2019.
Second.
Okay, moved to put them on the floor with an amendment that the appointments would expire on 12/31/19.
Mr. Chairman.
Moved by Mr. Horton and seconded by Mr. Anderson. Mrs. Fatika?
The EMTA is at a critical point. Council needs to vote tonight to get the board in place. So for that reason, I will compromise to amend for the 1-year term, because to delay would be like an emergency department delaying critical life-saving services while they're reviewing insurance coverage. So I will go along with that tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Fatika, any discussion on the amendment, or Mr. Horton, did you have a comment?
No, I digress.
Okay. Any further, we need to vote on the amendment first, so we'll have two votes here. Any further discussion? Let's just stick with the amendment first, which is essentially the date. Mr. Talarico?
Mr. Chairman, in order to insulate the motion to amend, and because it is council's taking a position that is contrary to the format that's laid out for appointments under the municipal authorities law, I would add to that motion that it's council's intent to limit the terms of those appointed to 1 year, notwithstanding the municipalities law, and that in the event that the council's motion and resolution is challenged in the court of law, that the appointments are nullified and would void and of no effect.
Who made the original motion?
Yeah, I asked that my original motion that language be included
So
in my original
Moves
motion.
to
Second.
include that language in the motion. Moved by Mr. Horton and seconded by Mr. Anderson. Is there any further discussion on this amendment regarding the expiration date of the appointments? Mr. Smith, roll call, please.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leone?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
No.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Dr. Faust?
On the amendment, yes. Any further discussion? Okay, a vote on these four appointments as amended. Mr. Smith?
Mrs. Fatika?
Yes.
Mr. Horton?
Yes.
Mr. Leone?
Yes.
Mrs. Law?
Yes.
Mr. Rastetter?
Yes.
Mr. Anderson?
Yes.
Dr. Faust?
No. We have a motion to adjourn?
Move.
Council stands adjourned.